The town of Rocky Hill, located in central Connecticut on the Connecticut River, has a long multicultural history. This video begins to tell the story of our town's cultural transformation from agrarian to suburban, past to present, asking the age-old question, who are we? The first culture we look at from our historic past on the land we now call Rocky Hill is the indigenous. Indigenous means first people. Most of the information about the indigenous people we have comes from the archaeological digs led by Rocky Hill residents and society members June and David Cook and Dr. Zarifis. The first dig was the Lone Pine site at what is now Quarry Park, where the indigenous people had a tool-making site around 5000 BC. The two other digs were the Morgan site and the Morgan Trench in the Great Meadows, which uncovered artifacts from a village that existed here between the 1100s and the 1600s. You can view and even handle the artifacts from these digs at Academy Hall. You can also read about the sites in the reports on our website. Also, noted archaeologist Lucianne Lavin wrote an entire chapter on the Morgan site in her acclaimed book, Connecticut's Indigenous People. We have all been taught some version of American history that might sound like this. The Europeans migrated to America in the 1600s. The Dutch, Adrian Block, sailed up the Connecticut River. The English, John Oldham, led a group from Massachusetts to establish Wethersfield. The Native Americans lived along the Connecticut River, and Africans were brought here as slaves. These early encounters in the 1600s and the interactions between cultures begins our American experiment. And admittedly, there is much more for us to learn. As a historical society, we try our best to talk about what we can actually document. Our town historian Bob Heron writes, quote, "No reliable evidence has ever been uncovered that any Rocky Hill ship ever served as a slaver or that there was ever a slave market in Rocky Hill." End quote. We do know, however, historic places where slaves were housed, and that in 1730 there were about 16 slaves in Rocky Hill out of a population of approximately 800. We know that the Whitmore House at 20 Riverview Road was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Shackles were found embedded in the floor of the cellar of the Duke of Cumberland Inn at 262 Old Main Street. And the Rocky Hill Congregational Church once had a slave gallery which accommodated about 20 people. We know early African Americans who lived in Rocky Hill. Caesar Freeman, who was a freed slave who served in the Continental Army during the Revolution, and Eli Rodman, buried in Rocky Hill Center Cemetery, who was part of the only African American regiment, Company G, that Connecticut sent to fight in the Civil War. In the 1700s, the Connecticut River changed course. Revolution was in the air, and the shores of the Connecticut River in Rocky Hill, known then as Stepney Parish, Wethersfield, was a bustling maritime center. 5 shipyards lined our waterfront. General stores, hotels, and pretty much the entire population of town was involved in the maritime trade. Historian Rufus Griswold documented much of this early history in the 1904 book, The History of Ancient Wethersfield. Ships built right here in Rocky Hill sailed down the Connecticut River to trade as far as the Bahamas and returned with goods. As a matter of fact, Academy Hall, constructed in 1803, was built as a school for the purpose of teaching navigation. In the 1860s, we find our first population statistic from the United States Census. There were just over 1,000 people living in Rocky Hill. Yes, Rocky Hill. In 1843, we separated from Wethersfield and incorporated into our own town. And around this time, between the 1840s and 1860s, the Irish, due to the potato famine in Ireland, migrated here. Familiar Rocky Hill names like Hayes, Dillon, and the Halligans arrived and established farms. We know that William Quinn and William Halligan were both foremen at the Rocky Hill Stone Company in the quarry in the late 1800s. By the 1880s, St. James Church on Chapin Avenue was established and provided a home for Rocky Hill Catholics. The founders of St. James Church had Irish surnames: Kelly, Ryan, McMahon. In the 1898 census, of about 195 families in Rocky Hill, 42, or about 20%, identified themselves as Irish. During the 1860s, the Valley Railroad was built, and on August 25, 1871, the first train rumbled through Rocky Hill. Residents assembled at the Meadow Road train station, unfurled banners and waved handkerchiefs as dignitaries and passengers boarded the train on its inaugural trip to Saybrook. The train provided a more efficient transportation of goods than boating and overland carriage methods. By the end of the 19th century, our shipyards were gone. Rocky Hill was no longer a maritime center. On January 15, 1909, the first trolley began running along Rocky Hill's dirt roads from Hartford through Griswoldville, past Academy Hall, and to Middletown. Soon thereafter, in the 1930s, the Silas Deane Highway was built. Like the railroad, the building of the Silas Deane Highway had positive and negative impacts on Rocky Hill. More businesses, people, and cars, but no more trolley, less horses, and farms. By 1930, Rocky Hill doubled its population to just over 2,000. Around this time, the early 1900s, the first wave of Italians came to Rocky Hill working in the stone quarry, the foundry, and on the farms. Tony DeMarco ran the quarry commissary, feeding workers named Rigoletti, Vincetti, D'Annunzio, Caruso, Vivacci, and Policio. We know that some came directly from Corvara, Italy, in the northeast, to work at the quarry, others from southern Italy. We know about Massinio di Bernardino and Sam Nazaro, who served in World War I. St. Anthony's Benevolent Society and the Rocky Hill Campilio Homes American Legion Post 123, built in 1938, a post partially named for Antonio Campilio, who was killed in action in France. After World War II, the second wave of Italians moved from Hartford to Rocky Hill. Our town historian Bob Heron has documented many of the Italians who made up the first wave of immigrants to Rocky Hill. We know that African Americans were in Rocky Hill since the 1600s. But in the 1950s, like many others, they also moved from the urban centers to seek a better life in Rocky Hill, since it was still considered a quiet agrarian town at the time. You can find how challenging their experiences were by reading or listening to the oral history of Rudy Burgess and his sister Gladys Kitchens on our website. Gladys described herself as, quote, white, black, and red, unquote. She said this about moving to Rocky Hill.
There were petitions to keep me from getting here. Oh yeah, a lot of petitions. And the scariest thing was the first day I was here, I heard this southern voice in my backyard. She'd come to pick up her little girl because my kids are in my backyard. And I said, what in the world have I moved into? And she turned out to be one of my very best friends, a blonde from Alabama.
Rudy described his house buying experience like this.
We finally found a place out here that they consented to sell us. They only showed it to us at night. And after they had taken our deposit, they said that they met us and saw that I was someone of color. That they decided they had another deposit. And after my lawyer checked into that, found out there was no deposit, went through the Civil Rights Commission, and that's how we got out here.
By 1950, our town population doubled again to about 5,000. In the 1960s, I-91 was built through Rocky Hill. Like the railroad and the Silas Deane Highway before it, this new transportation system impacted our community. I-91 displaced farms and families, sped up the change from an agrarian to a suburban town, and permanently divided Rocky Hill in half. The population grew to 7,500 people. In 1967, the Cora J. Belden Library was built. Our first mayor, David Mosier, was sworn in, and the St. Louis Cardinals beat the Boston Red Sox in the World Series. As an 11-year-old boy who loved baseball, I remember my brother and I in downtown Waterbury watching the World Series on a colored TV through a store window. Yes, I'm historic. In 1972, our population grew to 11,000 residents, and Century Hills, now called the Concierge, was built. The 1980 technology boom brought a significant number of South Asian professionals from India to work at the Hartford insurance companies. Rocky Hill's central location, strong education system, and good housing options provided an optimum place to call home. Many families who first moved to Rocky Hill, to one of the many apartment complexes, have now become homeowners in town. It is common to see children in town playing cricket and the elderly taking a stroll in ethnic Indian clothing. There are a growing number of small businesses such as restaurants, liquor stores, hotels, and IT consulting companies owned and operated in town by Indians. History is being made right in front of our eyes. The election of Mukesh Desai to our town council and Dilip Desai to the Board of Education. Dimple Desai, appointed to our Planning and Zoning Commission, and Tejal Nanavante Valam, our Democratic Town Committee Chair, all firsts of Indian descent. Today, Rocky Hill is home to over 1,000 South Asian families, representing the second largest community in our town. In the 1980s, the population of Rocky Hill grew to just under 15,000, and since then, our town has continued to attract more people in carrying on this American experiment. The most current census data, taken in 2020, shows that in these last 40 years, our community has increased by 5,000, with a population of just over 20,000 residents. We've come a long way from that pre-Columbian indigenous community along the river and that 1700s maritime village of 800 people. At the Historical Society, we view our recent past as importantly as our early history, but admit that our documentation of this time is not plentiful. We'd love to collect recent histories of all of our Rocky Hill neighbors, the Puerto Rican culture, and Bosnians, and those who we are unaware of. If there is a group we need to add, do your part. Please let us know. There is so much more for us to learn, and we invite you to share your story. Finally, we want to thank all the keepers of history. Rocky Hill archaeologists David and June Cook and Dr. Zarifis for teaching us about indigenous people. The early historians Henry Stiles and Sherman Adams of Wethersfield, and Rufus Griswold and his son Roger from Rocky Hill for writing about our maritime past, all the way up to the early 1900s in the history of ancient Wethersfield. Andrew Twaddle and William Dennis, who wrote Wethersfield and Her Daughters, daughters being Rocky Hill, Newington, and Glastonbury. And of course, our current town historian, Bob Heron, who continues the documenting tradition by writing books such as Rocky Hill in World War I, Hidden History of Rocky Hill, and the Images of America Rocky Hill book with Mike Martino. Since 1962, the Rocky Hill Historical Society has actively collected and documented Rocky Hill history. Our founder and first president, Peter Revel, our past society historian, Rod Wilskam, and all the other volunteers did their best to capture the times. We are still at it in 2022. Why? For you, for the public, and for the future. Because we believe that if we take the time to read and listen and watch, we could understand the past. And if we understand the past, perhaps we could build a better future.